Before we begin, if you like werewolves, eerie encounters, and the unknown lurking in the woods, hit that like button, drop a comment, and subscribe for more chilling tales every week. I'd never felt more alone, and I loved it. The field station was barely more than a log cabin with insulation, buried in snow halfway up the roofline. My only company was a wood stove, a half-dead satellite dish, and the endless sound of wind sweeping through spruce. It was perfect. Out here, no one expected updates or texts. Out there, the wolves didn't care who I was. I was 23, fresh out of my master's program, finally putting my research into motion. GPS collars, behavioral mapping, environmental response. It had all sounded clean and academic in the proposal. But now, it was just me and 5 tagged wolves somewhere in 100 square miles of ice and brush. I wasn't running from anything, not exactly. But I needed this. The solitude, the control, the clarity of it all. The last few years had left me worn down, academically, emotionally. My advisor used to tell me I was too obsessed with science and not obsessed enough with people. Maybe he was right. I'd blown a few deadlines, burned a few bridges, but out here, none of that mattered. Out here, it was just facts, data, nature, and me. I'd always been drawn to wolves, the way they moved, thought, responded to pressure. You could learn more from a month tracking their paths than from a year of classroom theory. I wanted to see how they survived and thrived in deep wilderness conditions, away from human interference. I spent the mornings checking signal pings, updating logs and collecting camera cards, afternoons hiking ridgelines and riverbeds on snowshoes, evenings analyzing patterns. That's when I noticed tag number 5. It had moved farther than the others, a lot farther. While the rest stayed loosely within a shared range, number 5 had broken east across the river basin, then back north through deep timber. It wasn't just wandering, it was running, and it didn't stop. I wrote it off as an anomaly. Maybe it was a dispersal male. Maybe it had smelled something. Maybe it got spooked by a bear. I told myself a lot of things, but deep down I already knew it wasn't normal. Something had it scared, and I had never seen wolves scared before. By the start of the second week, the entire pack's behavior had shifted. Number 1 had doubled back on its own trail for nearly 6 miles in a single night. Number 4 had circled the same ridge twice before darting east toward the river. Number 3 had stopped transmitting entirely. No battery warning, no slow fade, just nothing. The collar might have been damaged, or the wolf might have been killed by a bear. No reason to freak out, I told myself. But my gut said otherwise. I pored over the movement logs, overlaying GPS trails with elevation data, known den sites, and historical kill zones. None of it made sense. The wolves weren't hunting. They weren't resting. They were avoiding something. One night, I watched a string of motion capture clips from the ridgeline cams. The wolves weren't just scattered. They were erratic, running hard through terrain they normally moved carefully through. Heads low, tails tucked, muscles tight. One paused to look behind it before sprinting out of frame like it was being chased. They were in flight mode. All of them. But fleeing from what? It was full-pack panic behavior I'd never documented before. A bear wouldn't spook a pack that much, or waste energy hunting them. Wolves and bears coexist. This was something else. I even caught one of them, number 1, limping badly in 2 different clips, like it had taken a hit or barely escaped something. That's when I realized I hadn't heard howling in 3 days. Something really had them spooked. The next evening, I hiked out to retrieve a camera card from the north-facing bluff. Number 3 had passed through there the day before it vanished. I brought it back, dumped the data, and queued up the clips. At first, it was what I expected, just a blur of fur in the twilight, low to the ground and moving fast. But then, 8 seconds later, something else crossed the frame. It didn't move like a wolf. It didn't move like anything I'd ever seen. It was tall, upright, fast, too fast. It passed through in 3 strides just behind where number 3 had gone. I backed up the video and stepped frame by frame through it. On the second frame, the thing's head turned toward the lens. My chest tightened. It somewhat resembled a wolf, a heavily mutated one. I couldn't really see details. The footage just wasn't good enough, but the tilt of its head was unmistakable. It was aware of the lens, aware of me. I leaned closer to the screen, trying to make sense of what I was looking at, but my breath caught in my throat. It wasn't just watching the wolf. It was stalking it, like a man stalks prey. My stomach dropped. Tag number 3 hadn't failed. This thing must have killed the wolf and destroyed the tag in the process. That night, I couldn't sit still. I kept walking circles inside the small cabin that was the field station, checking windows, staring at the GPS receiver on the desk. Every sound made me flinch. But there was one small comfort. The station had been built bear-proof. Thick door, reinforced shutters, no crawl space. I'd read the specs when I first arrived and laughed at how overbuilt it seemed for a log cabin. Now I was grateful. I told myself whatever was out there couldn't get in, at least not easily. Eventually, I needed something to ground myself. I opened the storage cabinet in the corner, where backup gear, repair manuals, and decades of observation records were kept in cracked binders and dusty folders. I spent most of the night thumbing through them under the dim light of the overhead lamp, searching for anything out of the ordinary. Most were incident logs, maintenance reports, trail maps, and outdated wildlife surveys. But there were a few strange ones, handwritten reports from the 90s and early 2000s, mentions of missing dogs from nearby communities, hikers and hunters reporting something watching them in the woods, notes about wolves and bears behaving unpredictably and abandoning territory overnight. None of it was detailed, no conclusions, just fragments. But together, they painted a pattern, a pulse. Every now and then, always around autumn and winter, something seemed to unsettle the local ecosystem. And when it got warmer again, it would stop, forgotten, buried. I sat back, heart pounding, the folder still open on my lap. Whatever I had seen wasn't the first time something like this had haunted this area. But maybe I was the one who would really figure out what exactly was going on here. By morning, fear had started to erode into something else. Curiosity, laced with something close to excitement. I had no idea what the thing was or how it behaved, but I knew what it hunted, the wolves, and the possibility that I might be witnessing the behavior of an undocumented predator, maybe even a new species, sent a surge of adrenaline through me. My academic mind couldn't help but spin. What if I was the first to document this? What if the stories of unknown creatures in remote regions weren't all myth? I still had steady signals from several tags. Maybe if I followed the wolves, I'd find out more about whatever was tracking them. Maybe I'd find history buried in the snow. I loaded my gear, slung my camera pack over one shoulder, and strapped a bolt-action hunting rifle to the snowmobile. I'd found it in the station's emergency locker, standard issue for field researchers in bear country. I barely knew how to use it, but it made me feel a little less exposed. With everything packed tight, I kick-started the snowmobile and headed out. The ride was grueling. I crossed wind-blown ridges where the snow had hardened into glassy crusts, then dipped through frozen creek beds rimmed with jagged ice. The terrain was all steep angles and thick trees, forcing me to zigzag through tight switchbacks and duck low branches. Autumn had clamped down hard. Cold seeped into my gloves within minutes, and the sun hung low and pale, barely clearing the treetops before beginning its slow descent again. The world felt ancient and untamed, as if no one had passed through in decades. Maybe no one had. Along the way, I found carcasses, partial remains of what had once been foxes, rabbits, even a lynx. Most were stripped completely clean of meat, their bones cracked open and hollowed out, as if something had sucked the marrow straight from them. Others were fresher, half frozen in grotesque contortions, as though they'd gone through a meat grinder. What disturbed me more was what I didn't see. No tracks of typical prey animals, no signs of moose, hare, or even the usual flocks of ground-feeding birds. It was like the entire food chain had been vacuumed out of the area, leaving only these broken leftovers behind, as if everything that could run had already run. Late that afternoon, I found a vantage point on a frozen ridge overlooking a hollowed-out creek bed 200 yards below. I hadn't expected anything. I was mostly scanning terrain after loosely following the GPS signals of my wolves. Number 5 had passed near this area 2 hours prior, and its erratic path had caught my attention. I'd overlaid the collar data with my own topographic maps and rode out early on my snowmobile, not even sure what I was hoping to find. Maybe a fresh kill site, maybe new prints. Following the collar signals was less like tracking wolves and more like trying to map the behavior of a ghost. I'd circled twice through the valley below, trying to triangulate where number 5 had doubled back. It wasn't until I hiked up the far slope to gain a better signal that I stumbled onto the ridge and caught the first flicker of movement below. I hit the jackpot. Something resembling the creature from the tape was down there, partially obscured by scrub pine and shadow. A large black shape crouched beside the carcass of number 5, already half-eaten, its powerful limbs bent awkwardly, elbows high like a spider, claws sunk into exposed ribs. I froze, halfway through adjusting my lens, and dropped instinctively into the snow. The thing moved with slow, deliberate purpose, tugging meat from bone with large, clawed hands. Hands, not paws. More than anything, it looked like a caveman, dressed in heavy furs. But this wasn't a man, pausing between mouthfuls to raise its head and sniff the air, its motions filled with the heavy silence of absolute confidence. It hadn't seen me yet, or maybe it had, and just didn't care. But I got a good look through my binoculars. What I saw shook me to the core. Its head was unmistakably canine, long and angular, with a pronounced, but rather short, thick snout, and prominent black lips pulled slightly back to reveal yellowed, uneven teeth. The ears were tall and narrow, flicking toward sounds with twitchy precision. Despite the humanoid build, those arms, those hands, there was no mistaking the animal in it. This thing was no caveman, not even close. What I was looking at came terrifying close to the classic description of a werewolf, except for the fact that it was no myth. It was a breathing, walking, wolf-killing nightmare. I stayed low, heart hammering, barely breathing. The wind was in my favor. Through my binoculars, I saw everything: the curve of its spine, the uneven patchwork of fur and exposed skin, the broad, knotted shoulders. Its ears twitched at every distant sound. At one point, it stood, slowly, warily, and tilted its head toward the ridgeline where I lay hidden. My breath stopped, but it didn't move. It just stared out over the trees, as if listening to something I couldn't hear. Then it did something I wasn't prepared for. It sat. The thing settled back on its haunches and watched the forest, patient, still, like a sentry or a beast that ruled this place and had nothing to fear. It wasn't just some wild anomaly. There was intelligence in its poise, awareness, even majesty. And for the first time, I didn't feel afraid. I felt wonder. This was something unknown, something lost to time or born in secret. My hands trembled, not from fear, but from the overwhelming sense that I was witnessing something that shouldn't exist, something ancient, a remnant, or a rival. Eventually, it rose again, sniffed the air, and walked off on all fours with a strange, rolling gait, part predator, part ghost. I stayed there until the shadows swallowed its trail, my body frozen in the snow, knowing I had just seen something I would never forget. The next day, one of the GPS signals led me into a wooded gully. Pines towered on all sides, casting long shadows across the thinning snow. As I slowed the snowmobile and stepped off, the silence pressed down like weight on my chest. And just ahead, lying awkwardly on its side, was another wolf, one of mine. Its neck had been mangled, fur matted with frozen blood. The skull was partially caved in, the impact so violent the jaws had been ripped off. I leaned closer and saw deep puncture marks in the bone, teeth marks, huge ones, like from a bear, but shaped wrong, too far apart. It wasn't just a kill for food, it was overkill. Rage or instinct, I couldn't tell. But whatever this thing was, it wasn't just hunting, it was obliterating. I killed the engine, heart pounding, the sudden silence pressing hard against my ears. For a long minute, I did nothing, just stood there with my breath fogging up in the cold, spyglass clutched tight, but shaking slightly in my gloved hands. My mind spiraled, replaying everything I'd seen over the past few days. The strange behavior, that bipedal thing looking into the trail camera, watching it eat with its hands in that valley. The broken wolf in front of me and all the other carcasses. I told myself I just needed to breathe, that I was getting way ahead of myself. Then a branch snapped to my right, too close, sharp, and deliberate. Not wind, not animal clumsiness. Something heavy had stepped on it, on purpose or by mistake, and it was near. That's when I saw it, between the trees, standing just inside the shadows. Not a blur this time, but a full, terrifying silhouette. It didn't bolt. It didn't charge. It just stood there, watching me. The creature was tall, at least 6.5 feet when it stood upright. Its spine slightly arched and twisted like a half-collapsed tent pole. Mottled, dark skin stretched unevenly across corded muscle and bone. Patches of thick, black fur clinging to its shoulders and arms, like remnants of something it used to be. Its limbs were long and powerful, elbows bending too wide, fingers ending in claws that curled almost like hooks. It leaned against a pine tree with one large, clawed hand, steadying itself almost like a man would, a sight that sent an ice-cold shiver through me. My first thought was Bigfoot, but then I saw the face again. The snout, thick and shorter than a wolf's, but still elongated. The general shape of its head was distinctly canine, but set against eyes that seemed too forward-facing, too knowing. The mouth hung slightly open, teeth uneven and ragged, and its gaze, fixed right on me, wasn't just feral. It was intrigued, curious. That awful shape I had only seen from afar, now flesh and breath in front of me, hung motionless as it observed me, canine yet eerily human in its posture and behavior. Then it tilted its head slowly, like it didn't understand what I was, or maybe it did. Slowly, inch by inch, I began to edge backward, towards my snowmobile, careful not to make any sudden movement. When I reached it, I dropped to one knee behind the machine and brushed snow off the side-mounted cargo compartment, never taking my eyes off the beast. My fingers were clumsy with adrenaline, but I managed to unclip the latch and retrieve the rifle I'd brought. It felt absurdly light in my hands. I pointed it loosely in the direction of the creature. Whatever that thing was, I wasn't going to face it unarmed. For a moment, we just stared at each other. My chest barely moved. Then, without warning, it dropped to all fours and launched forward. The speed of it was unnatural, silent and sudden like a nightmare snapping to life. I fumbled with the rifle, but my fingers refused to work properly. Frozen in fear or cold or both, I managed to aim it and pull the trigger, but realized in a flash of panic that I didn't know how to chamber a round. There was no way I would figure it out in time. I dropped the gun right there in the snow. Heart hammering, I turned and swung my leg over the snowmobile. My boot slipped on the skid, nearly sending me over the side, but I managed to climb on and punch the starter. The engine roared to life just as I heard something crashing through the snow right behind me. I didn't look back immediately. I didn't steer. I just held the throttle wide and tore off in the direction the nose of the sled pointed. I tore back up the trail, branches lashing against my jacket, snow spraying out in rooster tails behind the treads. The gully blurred past me in a rush of motion and noise, and the only thought in my head was to keep going. Just keep going. But just before I reached the tree line, I risked a glance back. It was there, bounding through the snow in great lunging strides, low to the ground but fast, so much faster than anything that big should have been. Its black fur rippled across its hunched back, and those long arms swung in rhythm with its powerful gait. It didn't howl, it didn't roar, it just chased, and it was gaining. I kept the throttle pinned, veering into a patch of needle trees, the narrow trunks whipping past as I zigzagged through them. The terrain was tighter here, more unpredictable, but I didn't dare slow down. Behind me I could hear it, branches snapping, brush tearing, claws skidding over frozen soil. It was tearing through the forest like a wrecking ball. Then the sound changed. A guttural snarl ripped through the trees, followed by something heavier, deeper, like a roar that rattled through my chest. Not the creature, something else. A predator's bellow, then a crash, wood splintering, underbrush exploding, the unmistakable chaos of a violent impact. I twisted around just as a scream, not human, but not entirely animal either, shattered the air. A sound of pain, rage, and something else, shock. For a few fleeting seconds, all I could make out through the blur of trees was motion. A second shape, larger, stockier, slamming into the first like a freight train. Fur collided with fur, claws slashed, snow and bark rained down in a frenzy. One of them, the creature I assumed, let out a frantic snarl, followed by a wet, crunching thud. My ears rang. My mind struggled to grasp what I was hearing. It sounded like a bear had attacked it, but it wasn't a clean fight. It was brutal, unhinged, two large predators tearing into each other. I couldn't really see anything, but the noise, the snarling, the bone-snapping impacts, the rage-filled screams burned into my brain. And in that moment, one thought stood above the rest. There were things out here that I'd never imagined. I didn't wait to see who won the fight, although some twisted part of me desperately wanted to watch the spectacle. But a more reasonable part told me to keep going and get the hell out of there. I returned to the station in a haze of adrenaline and pain, my jacket torn and my arms streaked with cuts from the branches I'd plowed through during the chase. My legs ached from the ride, and I had a deep bruise forming on my hip where I'd slammed into the snowmobile's chassis. The next morning, against every screaming instinct in my body, I went back. I couldn't help it. Curiosity clawed at me harder than fear, though it fought me every step of the way. My hands trembled as I dressed. I kept glancing at the window, half expecting to see that hulking silhouette staring back at me from the tree line. Luckily, the collar on the dead wolf was still transmitting, giving me a way to return to the gully where I had dropped the rifle the day before. Even so, I moved slowly, constantly scanning the woods as I drove the snowmobile. The shadows between the pines looked too deep. Every snapped twig made me flinch. When I finally reached the spot, the gully felt colder than before, quieter. I retrieved the rifle where I had dropped it in my panic, fingers clumsy as I fumbled around until I finally had a round in the chamber. Then I slung it across my back. Even with the weapon now loaded and ready, I felt exposed, like I was anything but safe, like I was trespassing in something else's territory. I followed the track from memory and from the snow-churned path I'd left behind during my flight. My hands shook as I gripped the handlebars, not just from cold. It took almost half an hour, navigating the rough terrain and half-frozen gulches, but I found the spot where the fight had taken place. The air felt heavier there, still and tense, like the trees themselves were holding their breath. The scene was absolutely gruesome. Blood painted the snow in wide arcs. Tufts of thick black fur and lighter brown fur were scattered across the clearing. A pine trunk nearby had deep gouges raked through the bark, sap still oozing down like slow tears. One massive bloody imprint in the snow looked like a body had hit hard, then been dragged away. Some bones lay snapped and gnawed, some stripped clean, others broken open at the center. There was no carcass, just scattered remains. As I circled cautiously with my rifle raised, I found more evidence that chilled me to the core. Partially buried in the churned-up snow were what had to be the remains of the bear. Massive femurs shattered. The skull caved in like it had been crushed with impossible force. The rib cage had been torn open, the sternum twisted apart as though by giant hands. Whatever had done this had won the fight. But then something else caught my eye. Near the base of a stump, half buried beneath a mat of broken branches and frozen leaves, I spotted a severed hand, black-furred, massive, the claws still extended, almost as long as my fingers. It wasn't from the bear. The shape, the proportions, it was from the other one. The hand looked strangely human up close, like that of a primate, the fingers long and jointed, knuckles wide and weathered. But the claws, gipombos at the tips, ruined the illusion. Thick, curved, and sharp as knives, they jutted from the fingertips like weapons, blackened with dried blood. The palm was broad, calloused, and leathery, the fur thicker around the wrist where it had been torn loose. It didn't belong to any animal I would expect out here, or anywhere. 5 fingers, a thumb. But then I remembered the shape of its head and snout. Whatever this thing was, it had features of both canine and primate. I swallowed hard, heart pounding, and grabbed one of my sample bags from the pack. Using the tongs from my gear pouch, I sealed the hand inside and stashed it away, double-bagged. No definitive proof, but a lead. Then I got the hell out of there. I wouldn't send the hand to any lab or agency. I had someone in mind, an old friend from grad school, smart, meticulous, and working in forensic anthropology. She had access to tools I didn't. We hadn't talked in a while, but I knew she'd help. I also knew I had a thing for her, and maybe this was a way back into her orbit. I'd ask for her discretion. No papers, no disclosure, just a private analysis. I wouldn't mention where I had found it. Not yet. I'd feed her just enough information to get her hooked, to draw her in. Because I knew how her mind worked. Once she got a taste of something strange, something unsolved, she wouldn't be able to let it go. And maybe, just maybe, she'd start to see me the way I always hoped she would. Not just as a colleague or a faint memory, but as someone worth spending time with. It wasn't just about the analysis. It was about anchoring her to this thing, keeping her involved, keeping her close. If what I had was real, if this thing was truly out there, I didn't want to face it alone when I came back. And I would come back. With her, if I could. With someone smart, capable, and just as hungry for the truth as I was. This wasn't just some discovery. It was dangerous, and I needed someone who could help me. As the blades chopped overhead and the snow kicked up in spirals, I took one last look at the tree line. I already knew I wasn't going to be able to let this go. I was going to come back with better equipment, cameras, weapons, reinforcements, because whatever it was out there, it wasn't any animal known to science. And I was going to use that to make a name for myself.